Good evening and welcome very, very much to Conversations, where we're pleased to welcome to the program this evening Professor Robert Lekachman. And Dr. Lekachman is Distinguished Professor of Economics at the Lehman College here in New York City, has recently written a very interesting book called Visions and Nightmares, in which on the dust cover he is described as our best liberal political sage and wit. And Dr. Lekachman, welcome very, very much to Conversation.
Well, it's always nice to get friendly endorsements.
Yes, indeed.
But you know, it's the word liberal that is attractive here, because part of the damage that the horrible Ronald Reagan and his accomplices in crime have managed is to turn the word liberal, which used to be a word of praise, into a term of denigration.
Yeah.
So now the politicians, with the honorable exception of Senator Paul Simon, one of the gaggle of Democratic presidential candidates, they all run from the word liberal, because what's happened is that Reagan has sold the public on an interpretation of liberal as meaning foolish spending on dubious social purposes for people who don't deserve the money, welfare mothers, one of Reagan's favorite targets, poor people in general. And in fact, the current conservative wisdom is that helping the poor actually hurts them.
Yeah.
You give them money and they get lazier and more immoral. There's a touch of social envy, of course, in this, because, and a touch of race, more than a touch of racism, because there's a picture of the welfare family enjoying masses of sex, drugs,
rock and roll,
hedonism, loud music, and so on, so that the only one, as I say, of the Democrats who is willing to call himself a liberal and to speak with enthusiasm about the achievements of the WPA and Franklin Roosevelt's time is Paul Simon. Now, if we had sensible politics in this country, the word that I would apply to myself is not liberal, but radical.
Okay.
Because what I mean by radical is hitting the rich very hard. I'd begin with inheritances. I would say a good rate of taxation on inheritances, because I'm a moderate person, would be 100%.
Only?
No more. So that great fortunes would not be passed on, as they have been in our history, fortunes which have given people illegitimate advantages of all kinds.
There you would have a political process and the taxation and so forth, and the political ability of the society to function in terms of the society bringing itself to bear upon the economic marketplace and so forth. And that's what the liberal prescription generally is, that there's an increased ability for the government and government political forces to shape the society as opposed to so-called marketplace forces.
Now, let me pursue this a little bit further. The last liberal period we had was Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, circa 64, 65, 66, before Vietnam swallowed everything up.
Yes,
Now, from my standpoint, and remember I prefer to define myself as a radical, this particular emphasis was bound to fail for this reason. Because like most liberal prescriptions, Lyndon Johnson's prescription for Medicare and Medicaid was to cooperate with the private market, which meant, I'll pursue the Medicare thing for a bit because it's interesting. The doctors, who are utter idiots in identifying their own self-interest, by and large were against Medicare. They've made out like bandits under Medicare, because until very recently, the government reimbursed them at their customary fees, which were whatever they decided to charge. Now, what happened was, as a result of the original design of the program, which was in effect to pour public money into private hospitals and into the cash registers of private doctors, what happened was that the program got so dreadfully expensive that it began to act as a convincing argument against universal health insurance. Because if we can't even afford to subsidize the old folks, a group with which I feel increasing sympathy day by day, if we can't afford to subsidize even them, hopeless to think of extending universal care to the whole population.
And we arrived at a situation where the Medicare system, or the medical delivery system in this country, is woefully behind the times of industrialized nations.
Where the only country, with the dishonorable exception of the Union of South Africa, which doesn't have a universal health system.
Yes,
Canada, our neighbor, has one. The British have one, which takes only about 5.5% of their gross national product. We devote about 11% of our gross national product, and we leave nearly 40 million people totally uncovered by any kind of private or public insurance. Now, I regard this as a liberal failure, because what I think Lyndon Johnson did was to buy off the private providers. And it turned out to be so expensive that it's practically killed the subject of universal health care. Not a one of the candidates, as far as I'm aware, has even raised this topic. So that I separate myself from liberals who want to improve the condition of lower income families in cooperation with private markets. I would say, as a radical, I would substitute government structures for private markets that's failed.
That have failed.
That have failed. And healthcare has failed. Anything that leaves 40 million people totally unprotected, and a great many more only inadequately protected, is a failed market. And I'd add a second failed market. It's popular for economists, a bad lot, with the exception of Galbraith, Heilbronner, myself, and
a couple of other ones,
a short list of others. It's popular for economists to blame the housing shortage in New York City on rent controls. Now, there's a housing shortage all over the country. There are homeless people in Los Angeles. There are homeless people in Santa Barbara, not far from Ronnie's Ranch. Now, these are areas with no history of rent control. I would say that here's another failed market. It's not a failed market if you're making $100,000 a year. It's a failed market if you're in the bottom half of the income distribution, which means roughly for a family below $25,000 a year or so. It means you can't afford a house.
Well, then Lyndon Johnson, the war on poverty, which at the time was fought, and many things were done. There were training programs. There was a general intervention on the part of governmental forces into that marketplace-oriented
but always, it seems to me,
pattern that was probably more successful in improving the human condition than many people would tend to give it credit for in a blanket condemnation of what was done under the war of poverty.
Despite my complaints about Johnson's co-opting the private market, paying them off excessively, there is no question that during the 60s and even during the early 70s, the percentage of the population beneath the poverty line kept shrinking. The income distribution moderately improved in the direction of less inequity between rich and poor. These programs were untidy. A lot of them were ill-designed. Unemployment rates during the 1960s fell below 4% for most of the decade. Now, if you're thinking of a program that empowers the poor
if that's your function or focus, right?
Low
Question,
unemployment.
yeah.
If you turn the labor market in general into a condition where employers are hunting for people instead of one in which people are hunting desperately for jobs, you do more for blacks, Hispanics, women than any set of programs. And this was the great anti-poverty program of the 1960s, a full employment program. And while it lasted, it did a great deal to bring millions of people into the middle class, to diminish the impact of poverty. It actually had the effect, for the first time in our history, of making the elderly, the plus 65 crowd, somewhat more prosperous on average than younger groups.
They also began to pick up on some of the effects of the 1935 Social Security Act and the thrust of the New Deal into the marketplace, which was another era of a liberal prescription for the American economy that, and all would accept Social Security now, as a matter of fact. It has a tremendous constituency because so many have benefited from it.
Well, and you know, it's not only the official elderly, but you know, think of their adult children who are living in smaller houses, smaller apartments than they were brought up in. They may love their parents dearly, but they have no space for them in their limited quarters. And people in their late 30s, 40s, with parents in their 60s and 70s, have almost as much reason to be grateful to Social Security as their parents do.
And again, that's in the tradition of the liberal tradition, as it were, in the American scene.
It is.
And the war on poverty, the tax cut that Walter Heller suggested to President Kennedy and so forth, resulted in a liberal era, as it were, the 60s, which many people saw in favorable terms. There was an idealistic expression on the part of the youth.
Yes.
And so forth. And then at the end of the Carter administration and so forth, with inflation and unemployment, some of the problems, we were swept into what was a conservative era that we're coming perhaps to the end of? Or do these things go cyclical, as Mr. Schlesinger
there are people who think so, including the distinguished historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who actually got the argument from his father, who was also a very distinguished American historian. He argues very plausibly that our history is an alternation between liberal and conservative periods, and that we're running down on the conservative impetus. I'd like to believe Schlesinger on this, but I'm somewhat skeptical about it on several grounds. Ronald Reagan may be, as Tip O'Neill says in his recent and highly entertaining book, which needs no plug from me, it may be that Ronald Reagan is the most ignorant president in the 20th century. Why not all centuries?
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, he has had a shrewd capacity to play on American mythological themes. And I'm not sure that this is exhausted. The theme of individualism, self-help, you rise through your own effort, everything is possible to a person who works hard.
Xenophobia, evil empire, do you think it's gotten onto that point, or did it become super-patriotism?
The super-patriotism, American #1, USA all the way, go for the gold, all this
Feel good
jazz,
about yourself, be optimistic.
Feel good. You know, part of poor Jimmy Carter's affliction was that he was such a melancholy character.
Malaise.
He would come on to television wearing a cardigan with the thermostat all but ostentatiously turned down to 60 or maybe 55 and gloomy. I think had a lot to be gloomy about. But Americans, perhaps like most people, like to be encouraged by their national leaders.
So he's been extremely effective in terms of using the images of
extremely effective.
that
And
people want
what
to
frightens me is my apprehension that this set of emotional chords which he strums have enough resonance left in them so that Arthur Schlesinger, to the contrary notwithstanding, we may have a continuation with modulations, perhaps, of the same stick it to the poor, encourage the wealthy, do everything for corporate America, don't let the Pentagon get hungry. The same tendencies may have enough momentum in them to last
Through the next election?
through the next election, possibly, particularly since, well, you know, if you look at the Republican contenders, Dole and Bush, who apparently are the leaders, they're basically individuals of no pronounced ideology. You know, they've fallen in with the Reagan stuff. There was a time when George Bush was pro-choice and described Reaganomics as voodoo economics. But as he said at one point, his views have evolved. They can evolve again, of course. Dole is a pragmatic politician who mostly plays conservative music, but is capable, as on food stamps, of behaving in a vaguely humanitarian fashion. The Democrats, with the exception of Simon and perhaps the partial exception of Dukakis in Massachusetts, are all technicians. They say that we can make the economy function better. And they're full of engineering blueprints of this kind.
But they don't seem to accept the basic premise readily of an increased activity, in the liberal prescription of increased government activity in the name of equity or in the name of growth. That could be resurrected in terms of a full flowering up. They're all playing the
word
growth of the private sector kind of song, trying to be more effective.
The word that has been used to describe the departed Gary Hart, a victim of libido and megalomania, was neoliberal. Now, this is as apt a description in many ways of Gephardt, Gore, with some qualifications, Dukakis, not Simon. What in effect the neoliberals say is, yes, we're compassionate. Our heart beats for poor people, but we have to think of international competitiveness with Japan and Germany. We have to think of incentives to entrepreneurs. We have to think of the kind of education which gives incentive pay to teachers who really deliver the goods, teachers whose students can answer most of Hirsch's list of necessary cultural artifacts. And all of this, as you quite rightly say, departs a long distance from the aspirations towards social solidarity that were part of the New Deal and the Great Society thing. You know, the New Deal was a success because the Depression was so deep.
Yes, right.
It was so deep that it hit not just low-income people, not just working-class people, but middle-class people who lost their houses when the banks foreclosed mortgages, so that what Roosevelt was able to stitch together was a coalition of low-income and middle-income people. Now, I don't believe of good coming out of disaster, and I hope that there won't be a great crash.
As Ravi Batra and others are saying,
And they may be right, for all I know. But it is conceivable that the next wave of social progress will come only when the middle class hurts as well as the working class and the genuinely poor. It may take that kind of coalition to get a renewed wave of social progress. It's very easy to describe some of the elements of a new progressive era. The one I would emphasize above all would be a national goal of full employment.
A national goal of full employment.
Full employment.
Defined as 3 or 4% perhaps?
3%, 3.5%. We had rates like that during the 1960s without much inflation. Aim for that. Unions get stronger. Workers who don't like their bosses can give them advice about where they can stick the job and go off and find another job very easily. The balance of power between employers and workers shifts in favor of the workers.
Which it certainly has been shifting away from now.
Absolutely.
Even with employment, bringing employment often that keeps people close to the poverty line, even though they are employed now.
Well, you know, so many of the service jobs are at $4 an hour, $5 an hour, $6 an hour. The official poverty line now for a family of 4 is about $12,000 a year. So figure a $5 an hour wage into this. You're talking about an annual income below the poverty line.
So there really are a lot of people that are, as you say, hurting in the society, and the theme didn't play terribly well in the '84 election. Perhaps more and more people will be.
Yeah,
and I wonder,
but you know, the '84 election, Walter Mondale, who's a very decent guy with 4 times as much hair as the two of us
yes,
put
indeed,
together,
yeah.
Decent instincts, but if I may use a term from my ethnic background, a klutz. You know, here's a guy who delivers his big applause line in accepting the Democratic nomination. I'm going to raise taxes. Now, he was right, technically. It would have been sensible to raise taxes, but he didn't tell the public what they were going to get.
Yeah, that's not
for their
very good
increased
PR.
Taxes, you know, so I'm going to hit you with a big tax hike. Should I cheer about this?
Yeah, it was hard, and of course it showed up in the election.
Now, the Democrats are edging in various ways towards conceding that if one of them happens to get the brass ring, there will have to be a tax increase. They're doing it in a very gingerly, very careful kind of fashion. And it will still be a loser next year unless they couple it with a program of social benefits.
Social benefits that can be seen perhaps also to pick up on some of, again, the traditional liberal approaches to this. And I wonder, take a break now, and we come back and talk about what some of those, future projections of what that winning combination of the gathering of the roots of the Democratic Party itself, which many see they're abandoning, and how we might be able to proceed in the future. Our guest is Robert Lekachman, Distinguished Professor of Economics, Lehman College. We're taking a break now. We'll be coming right back, so please stay tuned. We're coming right back. Thank you.
About this. In our country, in Cyprus, this horror is reality. Since 1974, more than a third of Cyprus has been occupied by an invasion force from Turkey. We are a proud country. We have fought back every way we can. But we need help and understanding. We need you, people who love freedom, people who share our value of democracy.
And this country will be one again, and we will heal that jagged red scar that is across the body of this country.
I love New York. Health and Racket.
Back again with Bob Lekachman of Lehman College here in New York, talking about the possibility of a resurgence of a liberal way of thinking. One wonders if it might be that the democratic presence, as it were, the political realities, that there's lacking a charismatic figure on the order of Ronald Reagan, or on the order of a Jack Kennedy, or on the order of someone who can carry the ball and bring some of the ideas to the hearts of people and strike the emotional chords with some of these ideas. Maybe Mr. Cuomo? I don't know what you think.
You remind me of the fact, I'll come to Cuomo in a second, you remind me of the fact that the public's heart and its collective head are frequently separated.
Mm-hmm.
This is so clear in the current public opinion estimates of Reagan. He's getting still over 50% job approval. 2/3 of the public think he's lying about the Iran-Contra scam. Mm-hmm. You go issue by issue down his agenda, the public opposes it, but they still love Ronnie.
Yes, right, right.
And there is something about, it's never got to me, God knows. When I finally saw Bedtime for Bonzo, I thought the chimp was giving a great performance. But the fact is, the public loves this grade B actor.
Yeah,
if you want to be misanthropic, you might say it's a grade B public, but I'll retreat from that proposition. Now,
and he has carried the nation to the conservative swing, and that,
no question.
Does that reflect his leadership, or does it reflect the nation?
It reflects the persistence of some of the themes that I alluded to briefly earlier. You know, the cowboy theme, the reaching for the stars business. It's a grisly coincidence that the Challenger calamity happened on the very day that Reagan was scheduled to deliver his State of the Union address. And if the thing had gone off as scheduled, there would have been an interpolated shot, excuse me, of the Challenger soaring through the atmosphere.
Oh yeah, they've choreographed the communication
now
very well. I mean,
it may happen. Some Republican, I forget who, said that if the economy is in a recession next year, the Democrats can nominate a jackass and he'll win the election.
If the economy holds as it is, and
if the economy holds as it is, given the current field of candidates, there isn't a practicing charismatic among them. Kemp, who's running, I guess, 3, maybe 4 now behind Pat Robertson, the voice of the Christian right.
Who did very well in Iowa.
Didn't he, though? Jack Kemp apparently bores loyal audiences to slumber talking about the gold standard and other topics of burning interest. Bush always looks as though he's badly in need of a laxative. Dole has a nasty wit, which shows up now and again. The Democrats, maybe it's my own bias, look somewhat better than that. But the ability to move a crowd, as Cuomo moved that Democratic National Convention,
that was
the ultimate compliment when a bunch of politicians get together is that they stop conspiring with each other and actually listen to a speaker. And they listened.
Yeah, and did the nation.
Right. Now, Cuomo has it. I don't know what has moved him to refuse to enter the race, but he has the combination. It's a winning combination. I'm convinced. It's a combination of appeal to old democratic roots, compassion for vulnerable groups, appeal to America, a nation of immigrants. Here he is, the son of poor Italian parents. A man who made it, didn't go to Yale, went to St. John's, a working class Catholic university, an inspiring speaker, but a man who has balanced the state budget, Never mind that constitutionally has to balance it. Political science freaks attend to that kind of detail. A man who's cut taxes. He's against the death penalty, true, but at the same time he favors life imprisonment without parole for serious criminals. He has exactly the combination. He can press some of the same levers, emotional levers, as Reagan has been doing for 6 years or longer. At the same time, as he can combine this with an authentic recall of the New Deal and the Great Society. And I think it's possible, long shot, that if the Democrats wrestle with each other inconclusively through Iowa, through New Hampshire, through Super Tuesday in the South, the big combined primaries down there, and nobody emerges as a front runner, that the cry will go out for Mario.
Do you think the concern or the cry or the putting forth of the concern for the plight of the underclass in our own society, much less the underclass of the world, as it were, which has not been the front issue against the ideas of growth and individualism and so forth, concern for the underclasses of the plight of the underprivileged peoples of the world is going to be one that is going to be able to, as they say, play in the next election, or are people going to be narcissistically or selfishly or greedily concerned with their own interests? And what is that? It didn't play well in '84.
It wasn't really tried in '84. You know, I think Mondale ran an outstandingly maladroit campaign. My heart sank when he selected Geraldine Ferraro, and when I read that her husband was in New York real estate. There are probably people in New York real estate untainted by scandal, not undercurrent indictment, but it struck me as the kind of mistake a good clean-cut boy from Minnesota would make. Well, now to get to your question, whether the theme of compassion
that you said Governor Cuomo could speak well to.
I think he could speak well to it because his audience is not basically just the underclass.
No.
It's the working class. Now, the working class is a very amorphous sociological definition, but he's speaking to blue-collar Americans, New Yorkers. He's speaking to a great many underpaid white-collar and pink-collar workers. So that I think that a properly crafted program which said, yes, we're going to greatly improve unemployment benefits, for example, which have been sharply cut during the Reagan administration. We're going to do something to make working class families able to afford a house. We're going to make sure that we run the economy at a high enough economic pitch so that unemployment falls below 4% and the balance of power shifts away from employers towards ordinary workers and their unions. That appeals to a constituency very considerably larger than just the underclass, who don't vote. You know, one of the...
Well, I didn't mean necessarily that it was only the underclass that was going to be the constituency, but there would be a sense of the camaraderie with the underclass by the middle or even upper classes, who could begin to, a sense of social conscience could begin to become relevant
if you can
in the
begin
political
to
equation
convince
where it hasn't been.
the working class, the lower middle class, that they have common interest with people still worse off.
In this country and maybe even the world.
The world is harder because, frankly, generosity, social generosity is a luxury good. And our periods of world generosity have coincided with periods of domestic prosperity.
Well, it could be part of a broader vision that would bring something back to the American
but
dream.
it better not come attached with a big immediate bill.
Particularly given the fact that we've been landed with these incredible deficits, which is going to make any social spending very difficult.
Exactly. This is part of the problem that any incoming president will face. Conservatives are rejoicing about this. I've been in conversation with Irving Kristol, who is, I guess, one of the few people willing to call himself a neoconservative. Kristol, in effect, said, maybe this was hyperbole, that it didn't really make much difference who won the 1988 election, because the budgetary constrictions upon new social spending were so tight that even if a raving liberal, Paul Simon doesn't rave, but he's the nearest thing to an old-fashioned liberal, were to make it, or if Cuomo were to re-enter, he calls himself a pragmatic progressive, whatever that is, they would find that unless they took the guts out of the Pentagon budget, and I'd be happy to see this done.
Yeah, Archibald Gillies has written well, World Policy Institute, about how much of that could be,
No, if you took $50 billion out of the Pentagon budget, I suspect we would be just as secure from the evil empire as we are now.
Given the fact that the geopolitical equation is so much a matter of economic competition in any part, in any event, underneath the strategic umbrella or something that can be addressed with military.
You know, the Russians, if you believe conservative propaganda, have been in a position to sweep over Western Europe since about 1945. It shows a certain amount of self-restraint that in 42 years, the worst they've done is to put up the Berlin Wall. Not that that's a tribute to civilization, but the fact is the Russians are no more eager for a world war than we are. And if we could get over this obsession with the evil of the Soviet Union.
Well, Mr. Reagan reiterated the evil empire theme. He was
just this week
anti-detente, still trying to get away from it. The idea of verification of nuclear test ban treaties and so forth, and maybe that the prospects for peace on an international scale, which may have been thwarted by an overweening sort of almost paranoia on the part of the United States, as seen by many people in the world, might be able to be part of a foreign policy initiative. Mr. Gorbachev's making really important PR gestures to the world toward peace that many people are picking up on.
I think Gorbachev
is more popular in West Europe than Mr. Reagan.
And he should be. Gorbachev, I think, is for real. I think he recognizes that the Russian economy is in bad condition, that the Russian military are taking a bigger hunk out of the Russian gross national product than our military are taking out of our much bigger gross national product. And I suspect the guy would sincerely like to divert important resources away from the Soviet military and use them to prop up the civilian economy. Now, what I think frightens the Reagan people is the dreadful possibility that peace is beginning to break out.
Peace is beginning to break out, and why would that be something that would, what would be the reasons that this would be something that would be such a dreadful
Well,
fear?
for one thing, it would damage, perhaps fatally, their argument for bigger and bigger Pentagon budgets. It would encourage all kinds of critics to say, cancel, name your favorite weapon system, Star Wars, the MX, the stealth bomber, a new generation of nuclear submarines.
This would be, in a certain sense, saying that the impetus of conflict between the nations, to a considerable, the reason for that would reside here in the United States, as opposed to the adversaries that we tend not to like to think that way, and it's not politically expedient to say that there's some fault lies here in the United States for creating international tension.
But don't forget, pre-Gorbachev, the tacit alliance was between the Russian generals and admirals and the American generals and admirals. I'm sure that just as every year around budget time, Caspar Weinberger comes in with a new glossy book with the Soviet threat in classy graphics all over the place, I suspect that the Russian generals come in with their counterpart here. And the best friends of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, I suspect, are their Russian opposite numbers.
Yeah, I expect the idea of a peace or the idea of moving in that direction would serve well the domestic interests of the Soviet Union. If we were able to put ourselves on a more peaceful foot, it could serve well, it would seem, the United States
It would serve our
as well.
interest.
And I wonder if maybe, we have to take a break now, but I wonder if maybe we could take that theme up
Sure.
as the prospects for an international accords that there are some glimmerings of. We may have a summit coming up this year and so forth, how that might affect the political process as we begin to think ahead domestically and internationally. Again, we're talking with Professor Cashman at Lehman College. We'll be coming right back. Please stay tuned. We'll be coming right back momentarily. Thank you very, very much. We're coming right back. Back again with Bob Lekachman, Lehman College here in New York. We were talking before the break that the prospects for peace, which are sometimes said tongue-in-cheek that it would be a disaster, could in fact serve well the Soviets. They have an interest in it. We have an interest in being able perhaps to see a sort of, is there the possibility of a detente or some sort of a new relationship that could be a realistic event to occur?
Here I speak as a military expert because I rose to the rank of sergeant in the Second World War with one man under my command. But, you know, seriously on this, there's not the slightest question in my mind that the Pentagon budget has been driven in large part by paranoia about the Russians, plus a coalition of businessmen and labor unions to save jobs.
A military-industrial complex?
Military-industrial union complex, community complex. And this is inevitable when you're running the economy at 6%, 7% unemployment levels. So that if I could see, you know, let's dream for a moment, if we got a decent Democrat into the White House with at least some modest aspirations towards building some low-cost housing, extending health care, if not to the whole population, at least to children, kiddie care, as it's been called.
They're the new poverty group in our society, the young.
And then he asks himself the question, where does the money come from? It comes from the Pentagon plus higher taxes. But the Pentagon could give a chunk of $50 billion, I'm convinced, just to take a number, without damaging our national security, particularly if Gorbachev stays in control and cautiously moves to dismantle portions of the Soviet. If you're really dreaming, and I don't think it's totally impossible, we might be talking about a disarmament race for a change.
Wouldn't that be grand? Yeah.
It would be grand. Now, take a number. The Japanese are spending just about 1% of their gross national product on defense, and we've had to scream at them to get them to spend that much. We're spending about 6%. The Japanese are slaughtering us.
That
In the
might be one
domestic
part
market,
of the equation,
it's not the whole explanation,
right.
but it's part of it, because an important fraction of our brightest scientists, engineers, technicians, skilled craftsmen are making weapons. In Japan, they're making VCRs, computers, high-class consumer goods, cars.
And many of those strategic weapons really have no potential benefit at all since they
But
can't be used.
They're duplicated.
Yeah, it
you know,
really is.
they're a ridiculous waste of money. So that if we get, it's conceivable. I'm a pessimist by nature, but it's conceivable that we'll get into the White House. It can't be a Republican, I fear.
You do not think it's possible?
I don't see a sufficiently rational Republican on this sort of issue, but I could conceive of Simon Dukakis, if he resurfaces Cuomo, certainly, presiding over a shift of our productive facilities from weapons to buses, light rail transport, prefabricated housing, a rebuilding of collapsing bridges.
Oh, there's any amount that has to be to be done, and so forth.
And
whether or not you can have a transference from that military production into civilian production is another question.
It's difficult, of course, but the fact of the matter
we're
is,
sort of dreaming here in a way, but
the fact of the matter is that if you're talking jobs, you get more jobs spending public money on anything but defense. You do create jobs by defense, but defense stuff is heavily capital intensive, and you can spend the money on almost anything else, and you'll create more jobs. So that if you got an administration pledged plausibly to full employment, pledged to a menu of social programs that benefit the bottom half of the income distribution, I'm not talking about the desperately poor, the bottom half, which make it possible. This is the first generation which by and large is living in houses smaller than their parents.
Yeah, right.
Or no houses at all, apartments.
Used to be,
trailers.
Yeah, right.
If you could revive the prospect of reasonable middle class upward mobility.
Which is under attack now. I mean,
It's under severe attack. You know, we're all given these endless stories about the yuppies and so on. They're a tiny fraction of the generation that was born between 1945 and 1965. What's more common than the upward mobility of yuppies who go to work in the big law firms at 65, 70,000 a year, or as investment bankers at 100,000 plus what they can steal. What's much more dominant statistically is the number of people who are suffering from downward mobility, who are falling out of the middle class. You know,
well, you think if the society is suffering downward mobility, as you say, and there are large groups that do feel a sense of downward mobility, it makes sense in a certain sense. It used to be that one assumed that life was going to get better, life was going to expand, life was going to become, it was going to be relatively easy to rise in terms of living standards. If it isn't the case, and you're fighting that reality, people become more and more concerned with that, more and more materialistically oriented, and perhaps less able to assume a more because it's just a survival mode that jumps in.
They get
They're not
meaner.
able to think more idealistically
They get
or more
meaner.
broader. Right.
They get meaner.
And we live in a mean society
Don't
now,
tell.
don't you think?
Yes, we do. We
Yeah.
are. You know, don't tell me about your troubles.
Yeah,
I
I've
got
got
my own
troubles of my own.
troubles.
Right, that sort of
This
thing.
is the sort of reaction. And you know, I said a while earlier that generosity is a luxury good. You're generous when you're doing well yourself. And our society, in spite of, you know, the glitter of the Donald Trumps and the various other monstrous developers around town and around the country, the fact of the matter is that more women are working than ever before in our history, not because they're reading Miss Magazine and fulfilling their aspirations as feminists.
They damn well have to.
They damn well have to. And what they're doing is bagging groceries, typing Medicare forms at so much per form, key punching stuff, doing dreadful, dull, routine jobs at low wages. During the 50s and the 60s, it was genuinely possible for an average American worker to buy a house at interest rates on the mortgage as low as 4%, support a couple of kids, buy a car maybe with tail fins,
Yeah,
if you remember
some of them
back,
real pretty,
on one income.
Yeah.
His wife stayed at home
Yeah, and things were stable.
and raised the kids. Now, both of the parents, if we're talking about intact families, and there's an enormous growth of female-headed families with departed males somewhere, now it takes two incomes to support something like a middle-class style of life. Life has got worse for an awful lot.
Isn't that a potential? Isn't that if life has gotten worse for an awful lot of people and so forth, and if that is a fact, or maybe a conservative, isn't that potential constituency for political change?
It is, but it does need, you know, to go back to that word charisma, it does need someone who can do more than the Democrats tend to do, which is to describe in detail their
Way of getting at the
plans
deficit.
for individual training accounts, new methods of handling pollution.
I don't suppose we could draft you for president, Lekachman for president. Maybe we need
Well,
somebody
I'm
with
glad.
with real charisma.
I'm glad
that
you
would
mentioned
come on
that
the scene, or-
possibility.
yeah.
If you would care to head my exploratory committee,
Yeah.
I'm prepared to declare myself, provided there's a massive groundswell,
Yes, right.
for the first Jewish presidential
All right.
candidate.
Yeah, let's hear it first. Yeah.
I pledge myself, if elected, to treat Christians on an equal basis.
Oh, that's good news. Yes, indeed. Right. Great. That's good. Yeah. Well, no, but I mean, the charisma question is one. That's
It's
there.
relevant. You know, look at the characters. There are three non-starters that the pundits have been booming. Cuomo, who is, I think, a genuinely charismatic possibility. Bill Bradley from New Jersey, who's a very bright, deadly boring man who will talk economics endlessly. In a fit of error, I chose economics as a profession a long time ago, and I got tenure in the subject, and it got too late.
Yeah.
But that's by the way. Sam Nunn,
Yeah, but he's not
who
good.
matches Bradley in the boring department. These characters, you know, could preside over a pornographic movie and put people to sleep. You really do need somebody who can press some of the emotional levers. And I wish I saw somebody who's currently a candidate among the Democrats who can do that. It's a pity.
Makes it a little difficult to be a liberally inclined person at this time, and
It
one
makes
wonders
it
historically
very
or-
hard, you know. I'm a Democrat because there's no social democratic party in this country, let alone an outright socialist party.
No likelihood of that, bar a Great Depression or something. Yeah.
Very dim possibility. And in the absence of a genuine democratic left, what you've got is a distortion of the political process. You've got a party of the center, the Democrats, and you've got a party of the right, the Republicans. Now this has, among other unfortunate consequences, the fact that low-income people don't bother to vote. Why bother to vote when you can't tell much of a difference between the characters who are running on either of the tickets? So that although I'm moderately optimistic that some Democrat will win in 1988, I'm not sure that it's going to make as much of a difference as it should.
Well, these are all questions that are going to be increasingly of the moment as we come up to the election of 1988, and it seems to me it's good to get some sort of a feel for people who've been in the liberal ranks, as it were, over the long haul. It's not a particularly easy place to be right at this particular moment, given the history of the country, but who knows? Things change. There are a lot of changes between now and then, and what might emerge, the roots and causes that a charismatic sort of appeal could reach into the American psychology and so forth, might well include a great deal of those liberal perspectives that have been part of the political spectrum, and I think that you're one who has been able to voice those over the years, and I thank you very, very much for all of your contributions over the years.
It's a great pleasure.
And it was a pleasure, of course, welcoming you to the conversation.
Harold.
It's been a great pleasure, then, for you to have the perception that Robert Lekachman, liberal, distinguished professor, Lehman College here in New York City, speaking and ruminating and talking about some of the perspectives of the political, socio-economic scene, as it were, from a liberal perspective. It seems a good point for us to be able to begin to ground ourselves, particularly as we come up to a presidential election. Happy to be able to bring you his perceptions, and we on Conversations invite you to tune in again next week. We'll be coming back again next week. That's it for this particular segment. Bob Lekachman, once again, thank you very, very much indeed.
And thank you.
Good night. We'll see you next week.
We invite your cards and letters. Mail them to Conversations with Harold Hudson Channer, CMA, 226 West 26th Street, New York, New York, 10001.